June 14, 2024, the day the maps changed without a single shot fired. Let me tell you something most people missed. On June 14, something far more consequential than another round of sanctions or another NATO summit occurred. In a quiet, almost bureaucratic move, the Russian State Duma passed a law formally incorporating four Ukrainian regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, into the Russian Federation as inalienable territories. The language was deliberate, the timing was calculated, and the implications are nothing short of revolutionary. This wasn't just another escalation. This was Russia drawing a line in the sand, not with tanks, but with legal ink. And if you think this is just about Ukraine, you're missing the bigger picture. I've spent the last 3 decades studying great power competition, and I can tell you when a nuclear-armed state redraws its borders in defiance of the entire Western order, it's not just a local conflict. It's a challenge to the very foundations of the post-Cold War world. And yet, most of the media coverage treated this as just another footnote in the Ukraine war. That's a mistake. Because what Russia just did wasn't just about territory, it was about signaling to the world that the era of unchallenged American hegemony is over. Now, let's start with the official narrative, the story they want you to believe. The official war of aggression, a fight for democracy, and the West's moral duty. According to the White House, the State Department, and the chorus of Atlanticist think tanks, this is a simple story. Russia, led by an authoritarian actionist, launched an unprovoked war to erase Ukraine from the map. The West, standing on the side of democracy and international law, has rallied to Ukraine's defense, providing weapons, intelligence, and economic support to help Kyiv reclaim its territory. The goal is force Russia to withdraw, restore Ukraine's 1991 borders, and punish Moscow for its aggression. The recent annexation law? Just another desperate move by a regime that knows it's losing. The West's response? More sanctions, more weapons, and a firm commitment to stand by Ukraine as long as it takes. The data seems to support this. The U.S. has committed over $175 billion in aid to Ukraine since 2022. NATO has exited its presence in Eastern Europe, with new battlegroups in Poland, Romania, and the Baltics. The EU has imposed 11 rounds of sanctions, targeting everything from Russian oil exports to oligarchs' yachts. And in the media, the story is one of Ukrainian resilience and Russian desperation. The narrative is so dominant that any deviation from it is treated as heresy. But here's the problem with this: it's not just incomplete. It's dangerously misleading. What they're not telling you. Let's start with the most obvious contradiction. If Russia is truly on the ropes, why is it consolidating its gains now? The annexation law wasn't passed in the heat of 2022, when Russian forces were advancing rapidly. It was passed in 2024, after 2 years of grinding warfare, when the front lines have barely moved in months. That doesn't sound like a regime that's about to collapse. It sounds like a regime that's digging in for the long haul. And then there's the question of what victory even means. The West insists that Ukraine must reclaim every inch of its territory, including Crimea. But let's be honest, no serious military analyst believes that's possible without a direct NATO intervention, which would risk nuclear war. So why is this the stated goal? Because admitting that some territories might be permanently lost would mean acknowledging that the West's strategy has failed. And in Washington, failure is not an option even when it's staring you in the face. Now, let's talk about the real motivations behind Russia's move. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about signaling to the world that the rules of the game have changed. For decades, the U.S. and its allies have operated under the assumption that they can redraw borders, overthrow governments, and impose sanctions with impunity. Iraq, Libya, Kosovo, Syria, these weren't just wars. They were demonstrations of American power. Russia's annexation is its way of we can play that game too. And here's where it gets really interesting. The annexation law wasn't just a domestic PR stunt. It was a message to the global South. Countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and even Turkey have refused to join Western sanctions against Russia. Why? Because they see this conflict not as a battle between democracy and autocracy, but as a struggle between a declining hegemon and a rising multipolar order. Russia's move was a will the West accept that some borders are no longer negotiable? The answer, so far, is no. But the longer this goes on, the more the rest of the world will question whether the West's rules are really universal or just a cover for its own interests. The exited geopolitical, the end of the unipolar moment. To understand what's really happening, you have to out. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the death of the post-Cold War order. For 30 years, the US has acted as the world's sole superpower, enforcing its vision of liberal democracy, free markets, and human rights, often at the barrel of a gun. But that era is ending. And Russia's annexation is just the latest symptom of a much larger shift. Let's talk about realism for a moment. The great powers don't operate on morality. They operate on interests. And right now, three major powers are locked in a struggle for the US, Russia, and China. The US wants to maintain its global primacy. Russia wants to restore its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. China wants to displace the US as the world's leading power. Ukraine is just the battleground where these competing visions are colliding. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable. The US has spent the last 2 decades exiting NATO right up to Russia's borders, despite repeated warnings from Moscow that this was a red line. In 2008, NATO promised Ukraine and Georgia eventual membership. In 2014, the US backed a coup in Kyiv that overthrew a pro-Russian government. And in 2022, the West rejected Russia's demands for security guarantees, insisting that Ukraine had the right to join NATO. From a realist perspective, Russia's invasion was predictable. Not justifiable, but predictable. But the West's response has been equally doubled down on the same failed strategy. More weapons, more sanctions, more rhetoric about democracy. Meanwhile, China watches, learns, and prepares for its own confrontation with the US over Taiwan. And the global South watches too, wondering if the West's commitment to rules-based order is just a euphemism for American dominance. Military and strategic, the illusion of a quick victory. Now, let's talk about the military reality. The West has been arming Ukraine with increasingly sophisticated weapons, HIMARS, Leopard tanks, F-16s, ATACMS. And yet, the front lines have barely moved in over a year. Why? Because modern warfare isn't about who has the best technology. It's about who can sustain the fight. And right now, Russia is outproducing the West in artillery shells, drones, and missiles. The US and Europe are struggling to ramp up production, while Russia has turned its economy into a war machine. This isn't 1991. This isn't even 2003. Russia isn't Iraq. It's a nuclear-armed state with a population of 140 million, a vast industrial base, and a leadership that has shown it's willing to absorb enormous costs. The idea that the West can force Russia to withdraw through sanctions and military aid alone is delusional. And yet, that's exactly what the hawks in Washington and Brussels are promising. Let me be, I'm not saying Ukraine should surrender. I'm saying we need to be honest about the costs. If the West wants to escalate by sending troops, by imposing a no-fly zone, by directly targeting Russian territory, it needs to accept that it's risking a direct war with a nuclear power. And that's a war no one can win. The domestic political why this war won't end before November. Now, let's talk about politics. Because this war isn't just about geopolitics. It's about elections. And right now, the Biden administration has every incentive to keep the war going, at least until November. Here's Ukraine as a political winner for Biden. It allows him to portray himself as a strong leader standing up to Putin, while the Republicans are divided between isolationists and hawks. The more the war drags on, the more Biden can frame it as a struggle between democracy and autocracy, a narrative that plays well with his base. And if the war ends before the election? That's a problem. Because if Ukraine loses, Biden looks weak. If Ukraine wins, the Republicans will claim credit for the military aid they supported. So what's the incentive to negotiate? None. At least not until after the election. And that's a dangerous game. Because the longer this war goes on, the more entrenched Russia becomes in the territories it controls. The more Ukrainian infrastructure is destroyed. The more lives are lost. And the harder it becomes to find a diplomatic off-ramp. Scenario: the future no one wants to talk about. So where does this go from here? Let's look at the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case. The West finally accepts that Ukraine can't reclaim all its territory. A negotiated settlement is reached, with some form of autonomy for the Russian-occupied regions. Ukraine joins the EU but not NATO. Russia withdraws from some areas but keeps Crimea and parts of the Donbass. The war ends, but the underlying tensions remain. This is the least bad outcome, but it requires the West to admit that it can't dictate the terms of peace. Scenario 2, the most likely. The war grinds on for years. Ukraine makes incremental gains, but Russia digs in deeper. The West continues to arm Ukraine, but the flow of weapons slows as domestic fatigue sets in. Russia's economy adapts to sanctions, and China steps in to fill the gaps. The front lines stabilize, but the war never truly ends. It becomes a frozen conflict, like Korea or Cyprus. And in the meantime, the world moves on because the West can't sustain its focus on Ukraine forever. Scenario 3, the worst case. The war escalates. NATO gets directly involved, either by accident or design. Russia responds with tactical nuclear weapons. The US retaliates, and suddenly, we're in a nuclear standoff. The global economy collapses. Millions die. And the world order as we know it is destroyed. This isn't hyperbole. It's a real possibility if the West keeps pushing Russia into a corner. None of these scenarios are good. But the longer the West clings to the fantasy of total victory, the more likely we are to end up in Scenario 3. Grand strategy: the failure of liberal hegemony. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture. Because this war isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the failure of American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. The problem? It hasn't worked. Iraq is a failed state. Afghanistan collapsed the moment the US left. Libya is a warlord-run hellscape. Syria is a Russian-Iranian client state. And now, Ukraine is a proxy war that's draining American resources while doing nothing to advance US interests. The truth is, the US can't afford to be the world's policeman anymore. It's overstretched, its economy is struggling, and its political system is polarized. And yet, the foreign policy establishment keeps pushing the same failed policies: more interventions, more regime change, more sanctions. Why? Because admitting failure would mean admitting that the entire post-Cold War order was built on a lie. Russia's annexation is a direct challenge to that order. And the West's response, more of the same, isn't just ineffective. It's dangerous. What we should do instead. So what's the alternative? Let me tell you something: the US needs to accept that it can't dictate the terms of the New World Order. That doesn't mean surrendering to Russia or China. It means recognizing that the era of unipolarity is over, and that the US needs to adapt to a multipolar world. Here's what that looks. 1. Diplomacy, not escalation. The US should push for a negotiated settlement, even if it means accepting that Ukraine won't get all its territory back. The alternative is a forever war that drains American resources and risks nuclear escalation. 2. Realist great power management. The US needs to recognize that Russia and China have legitimate security interests. That doesn't mean endorsing their actions, but it does mean accepting that they have spheres of influence. The alternative is endless conflict. 3. Economic statecraft over military force. Sanctions have failed to stop Russia. Instead of doubling down, the US should focus on rebuilding its own economy and reducing its dependence on global supply chains. 4. A new transatlantic bargain. Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own defense. The US can't keep subsidizing European security while China rises in the Pacific. This isn't isolationism. It's realism. And it's the only way to avoid a catastrophic war. Reflective the choice before us. Let me leave you with this. The world is changing, and the old rules no longer apply. Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territories isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the end of an era. The question: will the West adapt, or will it cling to a failed strategy until it's too late? I've spent my career studying these conflicts, and I can tell you the most dangerous moment in history is when a declining power refuses to accept its decline. That's where we are today. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but it's no longer the only one. And if it keeps acting like it is, the consequences will be catastrophic. The choice is ours. We can keep pretending that the old order is still intact, or we can accept reality and adapt. The first path leads to war. The second leads to survival. The time to choose is now. Because the maps are changing, and the next move is ours. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the fundamental shift in how wars are fought and won in the 21st century. The Russians have learned the lessons of the past 3 decades, lessons the West has stubbornly refused to acknowledge. Let me explain why this matters. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the US and its allies assumed they had won the Cold War outright. The narrative was democracy and free markets had triumphed, and the rules-based international order was now the only game in town. But that assumption ignored a critical reality: Russia never accepted its defeat. It retreated, licked its wounds, and waited. And while the West was busy celebrating its unipolar moment, Moscow was studying how to break it. Take the 2008 Georgia War. The Russians didn't just invade, they demonstrated a new model of warfare. They used cyber attacks to blind Georgian command centers, deployed special forces to seize key infrastructure, and exploited ethnic divisions to justify their intervention. The message was: in the 21st century, wars aren't won by mass tank formations alone. They're won by controlling the narrative, paralyzing your enemy's decision-making, and securing your gains before the international community can react. Then came Crimea in 2014. The West responded with sanctions, but the Russians had already achieved there. They had taken territory without triggering a full-scale war. The annexation was swift, decisive, and most importantly, irreversible. The lesson? In a world where nuclear powers face off, limited wars can be won if you act fast enough to make your gains permanent before your adversary can muster a response. Now, in 2024, we're seeing the culmination of that strategy. The Russians aren't just fighting for Donbass, they're fighting to redefine the rules of engagement. They've learned that in a multipolar world, the side that controls the physical terrain controls the diplomatic outcome. That's why they're consolidating their hold on Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk before any ceasefire. They know that once those territories are integrated into Russia with Russian passports, Russian laws, and Russian military bases, no future Ukrainian government will ever get them back. Not without a war that would make the current conflict look like a skirmish. Here's the uncomfortable: the West still thinks this is a war about principles. The Russians know it's a war about power. And right now, power is measured in square kilometers, not moral high ground. Let me give you an example. In 2015, after the Minsk agreements, the West assumed that time was on Ukraine's side. The thinking was that if Ukraine could just hold out, Russia would eventually collapse under economic pressure or domestic unrest. But the Russians had a different calculus. They knew that the longer the conflict dragged on, the more territory they could take without triggering a NATO response. And they were right. By the time the West woke up to the reality of the situation, Russia had already secured its land bridge to Crimea and was digging in for the long haul. Now, fast forward to today. The Russians have adapted their military strategy in real time. They've shifted from large-scale offensives to a war of attrition, grinding down Ukrainian forces while avoiding the kind of catastrophic losses that could trigger a wider conflict. They've also weaponized their energy exports, turning Europe's dependence on Russian gas into a strategic vulnerability. And most importantly, they've exploited the West's internal divisions, betting, correctly, that the US and Europe would eventually tire of the war. The military implications of this are profound. The Russians have demonstrated that in a protracted conflict, the side with the higher pain threshold wins. They've also shown that in an era of precision-guided munitions and electronic warfare, the traditional advantages of Western militaries, superior technology, air superiority, and logistical dominance, can be neutralized by sheer mass and determination. Take the battle for Avdiivka. The Ukrainians fought bravely, but the Russians overwhelmed them with waves of infantry, supported by relentless artillery barrages. The message was, in a war of attrition, numbers matter more than tactics. And right now, the Russians have the numbers. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. The Russians aren't just preparing for a long war, they're preparing for the next war. They've rebuilt their military-industrial complex from the ground up, increasing defense production to levels not seen since the Soviet era. They've also forged a de facto alliance with Iran, North Korea, and China, creating a bloc of revisionist powers that are openly challenging U.S. hegemony. Now, some will argue that this is just temporary, that the West can outlast Russia in the long run. But that's a dangerous assumption. The reality is that the US and its allies are facing a perfect storm of a rising China, a resurgent Russia, a fractured Europe, and a domestic political landscape that is increasingly hostile to foreign entanglements. The idea that the West can sustain a prolonged conflict with Russia while also containing China is, frankly, delusional. Let me put this in historical perspective. In 1914, the great powers of Europe stumbled into a war that none of them wanted and none of them could win. The result was 4 years of slaughter, the collapse of 4 empires, and the rise of totalitarianism. Today, we're in a similar moment. The difference is that this time, the stakes are even higher. We're not just talking about the balance of power in Europe, we're talking about the future of the international order itself. So what does this mean for the West? It means we need to stop thinking in terms of victory and start thinking in terms of survival. It means accepting that we can't dictate the outcome of this war, we can only shape it. And it means recognizing that the longer this conflict drags on, the more territory Russia will take, the more influence it will gain, and the more dangerous the world will become. Here's the bottom: the Russians are playing a long game, and they're winning. The West is still playing by the old rules, and it's losing. If we don't adapt and fast, we're going to wake up one day to a world where Russia is a permanent military power in Europe, China dominates Asia, and the US is left scrambling to defend its own hemisphere. That's not a prediction. It's a warning. And it's one we ignore at our peril. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine anymore. The war has become a domestic political weapon inside Russia, and Putin is using it to reshape his country in ways that will outlast him. Let's look at the numbers. Since the invasion, Russia's defense budget has ballooned to nearly 6% of GDP, higher than at any point since the Soviet collapse. For comparison, the US spends about 3.5% of GDP on defense, and even that is considered unsustainable by many economists. But in Russia, this isn't just about guns and tanks. It's about creating an entire wartime economy, one that is deliberately decoupling from the West and embedding itself in a new Eurasian bloc. Here's the uncomfortable: Putin isn't just preparing for a long war, he's preparing for a permanent one. The recent constitutional amendments, the crackdown on dissent, the mass mobilization of industry, these aren't temporary measures. They're structural changes. In June, Putin signed a decree extending the powers of the FSB, giving it direct control over key sectors of the economy under the guise of national security. This isn't just about repression, it's about centralizing economic power in the hands of the security state. And once that power is centralized, it doesn't get decentralized. We've seen this movie before, in the 1930s, in the 1970s, and the ending is never pretty. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimension. The war has given Putin a pretext to eliminate any remaining opposition, but it's also forced him to make a devil's bargain with the Russian elite. The oligarchs who once kept their money in London and their yachts in the Mediterranean are now being told, in no uncertain terms, that their future lies in Moscow, Beijing, or Tehran. The message is: if you want to keep your wealth, you'd better start investing in the motherland. And many are complying. Just look at the recent exodus of Western commies, BP, Shell, Exxon, all selling their Russian assets at fire sale prices, often to state-backed buyers. This isn't just about sanctions, it's about forcing a reorientation of the Russian economy toward the East. But here's this reorientation isn't just economic. It's ideological. Putin has spent the last 2 years framing this war as an existential struggle against the West, a clash of civilizations. And in doing so, he's tapped into something deeper than nationalism. He's tapped into a sense of historical grievance that runs through Russian society. The narrative isn't just that Ukraine is a Nazi state, it's that the West has been trying to destroy Russia for centuries, from Napoleon to Hitler to NATO action. And now, with the war, Putin is positioning himself as the defender of Russian civilization, the man who finally stood up to the West and won. Let me explain why this matters. When you frame a war as an existential struggle, you don't just mobilize your military, you mobilize your society. And that's exactly what Putin is doing. The recent partial mobilization wasn't just about sending more troops to the front, it was about signaling to the Russian people that this war is their war, that they have a stake in its outcome. And it worked. Despite the initial the mobilization has been largely accepted, even embraced, by a significant portion of the population. Why? Because Putin has spent years preparing the ground, using state media to create a parallel reality where Russia is the victim, not the aggressor. Now, some will argue that this is unsustainable, that eventually, the Russian people will tire of the war, that the economy will collapse, that Putin will be overthrown. But that's a dangerous assumption. The Russian state has proven remarkably resilient over the centuries, and Putin has spent the last 2 decades building a system that is designed to survive even his own demise. The Siloviki, the security elites, are more powerful than ever, and they have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The oligarchs, meanwhile, have been forced to choose between loyalty to Putin and exile. And the Russian people? Well, they've been conditioned to accept hardship as the price of greatness. Here's the scenario I see unfolding. In the short term, Russia will continue to grind forward in Ukraine, taking more territory and consolidating its gains. The West will respond with more sanctions, more weapons, more rhetoric, but none of it will be enough to turn the tide. And as the war drags on, the domestic political situation in Russia will only harden. The security state will tighten its grip, the economy will become more militarized, and the ideological divide between Russia and the West will deepen. In the medium term, we'll see a Russia that is more isolated, more authoritarian, and more dependent on China than ever before. But it will also be a Russia that is more dangerous. A Russia that has learned to live without the West, that has built a wartime economy, and that sees itself as locked in a permanent struggle for survival. And that's the Russia we'll have to deal with for decades to come. Now, let's talk about the West's response. Because so far, it's been woefully inadequate. The US and Europe are still operating under the assumption that this is a temporary crisis, that if we just hold out long enough, Russia will collapse. But that's not how this works. The longer the war goes on, the more entrenched Russia becomes, both militarily and politically. And the more entrenched Russia becomes, the harder it will be to dislodge. Here's what needs to happen. First, the West needs to accept that Ukraine is not going to win this war in the traditional sense. The best-case scenario is a frozen conflict, a stalemate that leaves Russia in control of significant territory but unable to achieve its maximalist goals. And even that will require a level of commitment from the West that we haven't seen yet. We're talking about sustained military aid, economic support, and a willingness to bear the costs of a long-term confrontation with Russia. Second, the West needs to start thinking about containment, not just in Ukraine, but across the entire Eurasian landmass. That means strengthening NATO's eastern flank, deepening ties with partners like India and Japan, and countering Russia's influence in places like the Middle East and Africa. It also means recognizing that China is the bigger long-term threat and adjusting our strategy accordingly. Because if we don't, we'll find ourselves fighting a two-front war, one in Europe, one in Asia, and that's a war we can't win. Finally, the West needs to get its own house in order. The political divisions in the US and Europe are a gift to Putin. He knows that the longer the war drags on, the more likely it is that Western support for Ukraine will fracture. And he's doing everything he can to exploit those divisions. We saw it with the recent debt ceiling debate in the US, where Ukraine aid became a political football. We see it in Europe, where populist parties are gaining ground on promises to end support for Ukraine. If the West can't maintain a united front, then all the military aid in the world won't matter. Let me leave you with this. In 1946, George Kennan wrote his famous long telegram, arguing that the Soviet Union was an inherently actionist power that could only be contained, not defeated. That telegram shaped U.S. foreign policy for the next 4 decades. Today, we need a new long telegram, one that recognizes that Russia is once again an actionist power, but one that is far more dangerous than the Soviet Union ever was. Because this time, Russia isn't just a communist state with a flawed ideology. It's a nuclear-armed revisionist power with a chip on its shoulder and a willingness to use force to rewrite the rules of the international order. The question isn't whether we can defeat Russia. The question is whether we can survive it. And right now, the answer isn't looking good. Now, what most people don't realize is that we're not just dealing with a tactical problem, we're staring down a fundamental mismatch in strategic culture. The West still operates under the assumption that wars end when both sides sit down at a negotiating table and split the difference. But that's not how Russia thinks. For Moscow, war isn't a failure of diplomacy, it's diplomacy by other means. And if you look at the history, from the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to the Minsk agreements in 2014, every time Russia has been forced to the table, it's treated those agreements as temporary pauses, not permanent settlements. The difference now? They're not even pretending to negotiate in good faith. They're annexing territory while the world watches, betting that we'll blink first. Let me explain why this matters. The establishment narrative in Washington and Brussels is that time is on our side, that economic sanctions will eventually strangle the Russian war machine, that demographic decline will hollow out the regime, that the sheer weight of Western arms will grind down Putin's forces. But this is dangerously naive. Russia has survived worse. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in World War II and still emerged as a superpower. The Russian economy contracted by 45% in the 1990s, and yet the state didn't collapse, it adapted. Today, despite sanctions, Russia's GDP is projected to grow by 2.6% in 2024, according to the IMF, while Europe stagnates. Their military-industrial complex is running at full tilt, producing more artillery shells than the entire West combined. And let's not Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and Putin has already threatened to use it more times in the past 2 years than the Soviet Union did in the entire Cold War. Here's the uncomfortable: we are not winning this war. We're not even containing it. What we're doing is managing decline, our own. Every day that passes without a decisive shift in strategy is another day Russia consolidates its gains, another day China watches and learns, another day the global South sees that the West's word isn't worth the paper it's printed on. And the longer this drags on, the more the balance of power tilts against us. So what are our alternatives? I see 3 broad paths forward, each with its own risks and trade-offs. The first is the path of escalation. Not just more weapons for Ukraine, but a fundamental rethinking of what victory looks like. That means long-range missiles that can strike deep into Russian territory, not just the occupied zones. It means a no-fly zone enforced by NATO, not just air defense systems. It means recognizing that this is not just Ukraine's war, it's a war for the future of the European security order, and if we're serious about defending that order, we need to act like it. The problem? Escalation risks direct confrontation with Russia, and in a nuclear standoff, the side that blinks first loses. But here's the: Putin has already escalated. He's annexed territory, mobilized his population, and threatened nuclear strikes. The question isn't whether we can afford to escalate, it's whether we can afford not to. The second path is the path of managed retreat. Accept that Ukraine can't win back all its territory, push Kiev to negotiate from a position of relative strength, and use the breathing room to rebuild Western defenses. This is the realists' better a frozen conflict than a hot war that spirals out of control. The problem? It rewards aggression. If Russia gets to keep what it's taken, it sends a message to every revisionist power on earth that might makes right. And let's be, if we force Ukraine to the table now, it won't be a peace deal, it'll be a surrender in all but name. The Ukrainians know this. That's why Zelensky has repeatedly said he won't negotiate with Putin. And if we abandon them, we don't just betray an ally, we betray the principle that borders can't be changed by force. That's a principle worth fighting for, because if it goes, so does the entire post-World War II order. The third path is the path of strategic patience, what I call the long telegram 2.0 approach. Recognize that this is a generational struggle, not a 2-year conflict. That means building a sustainable model for supporting Ukraine, one that doesn't rely on the whims of US congressional politics or European populist movements. It means investing in our own defense industrial base, because right now, we're running out of ammunition and the Russians aren't. It means rethinking our energy policies, because as long as Europe depends on Russian gas, even indirectly, we're funding the war machine that's killing Ukrainians. And it means preparing for the long game in Asia, because China is watching. If we show weakness in Europe, Beijing will take notes for Taiwan. Now, I know what some of you are. This is all well and good, but what about the cost? The US is $34 trillion in debt. Europe is facing a cost of living crisis. How can we afford this? To which how can we afford not to? The cost of inaction is far higher. If Russia wins in Ukraine, the next war won't be in Donbass, it'll be in the Baltics. And if we let that happen, we're not just abandoning NATO, we're abandoning the idea that democracy can survive in a world where autocracies set the rules. Let me leave you with a historical parallel. In the 1930s, the West faced a similar confront Hitler early, or wait until he was too strong to stop. We all know how that turned out. The difference today is that Putin isn't Hitler, he's worse. Hitler at least had a coherent ideology. Putin has only one guiding the survival of his regime, at any cost. And that makes him far more dangerous, because he's not constrained by ideology or morality. He's constrained only by what he thinks he can get away with. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at a crossroads. We can choose to act now, while we still have the chance to shape the outcome. Or we can choose to wait, and let the future be decided for us. I don't like our odds either way. But if we're going to lose, let's at least lose on our feet, not on our knees. Because here's the final uncomfortable: this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about whether the 21st century will be defined by the rule of law or the law of the jungle. And right now, the jungle is winning.